I'm Miles Vexler, and I just witnessed a political performance so bad it deserved its own Rotten Tomato score. You would think by now they would at least hire better scriptwriters for these press briefings, but no. Same circles, same clowns, just a shinier tent. If you are new here, welcome to the place where we untangle the nonsense and ask the questions they hope you never do. Tap subscribe because the next act in this political theater, oh, it's a doozy. Don't blink. You might miss the moment someone accidentally tells the truth. ICE raids. National Guard on the streets. Gavin Newsom dares Trump to arrest me. Marines on standby. Protesters clash. Is this law enforcement or a political power grab? As California resists, Trump escalates. What's really happening in LA and what are they distracting us from? Tune in for the full truth.
You've also mentioned Mayor Karen Bass and Governor Gavin Newsom, and there have been threats, previously that if you stand in the way of your enforcement operations, you could be subject potentially to arrest. Are you saying that about Mayor Bass and Governor Newsom? Are they at risk of being arrested?
I'll say it about anybody. You cross that line.
He's a tough guy. Why doesn't he do that? He knows where to find me. But you know what? Lay your hands off 4-year-old girls that are trying to get educated. Lay your hands off these poor people. They're just trying to live their lives, man. Trying to live their lives, paying their taxes. Been here 10 years. The fear, the horror. The hell is this guy? Come after me, arrest me. Let's just get it over with. Tough guy. I don't give a damn.
Trump border czar Tom Homan and Democratic Governor Gavin Newsom of Florida speaking to NBC's Jacob Soboroff during a weekend of significant unrest in Southern California as protesters took to the streets in response to ICE raids across the Los Angeles area. This morning, the National Guard is on the ground after President Trump deployed thousands. Significant unrest in Southern California as protesters took to the streets in response to ICE raids across the Los Angeles area. This morning, the National Guard is on the ground after President Trump deployed thousands of troops there. Jacob Soboroff is standing by in LA with the latest, along with NBC News senior Homeland Security correspondent Julia Ainsley. Meanwhile, President Trump is warning Elon Musk there will be very serious consequences if he funds Democratic candidates after their very public falling out. We'll discuss whether Democrats should now be looking to bring Musk back into their fold. Plus, it was a huge...
In a dramatic challenge, Governor Newsom dares Trump to arrest him amid escalating ICE raids and tensions in Southern California. Governor Gavin Newsom fiercely rebukes Trump advisor Tom Homan, daring him to arrest him over interference in ICE raids. Newsom defends immigrant families, decries National Guard deployment, and calls for compassion and legal integrity amid growing public unrest in Los Angeles.
Welcome to Morning Joe. It is Monday, June 9th, and we have a lot to get to. Our panel this morning, co-host of our fourth hour, contributing writer at The Atlantic, Jonathan Lemire, U.S. special correspondent for BBC News, and the host of The Rest is Politics podcast. Caddy Kay is with us. Senior writer at The Dispatch, David Drucker, is here. He's also a Bloomberg columnist and co-founder and CEO of Axios. Jim Vandehei joins us. So we're entering Day 4 of protests in Los Angeles as demonstrators continue to clash with law enforcement. The protests began on Friday in response to immigration raids. ICE says it arrested 118 people after executing search warrants at multiple locations last week, 44 of whom were taken into custody during Friday's operation. On Saturday, California Governor Gavin Newsom said the situation was under control. This despite clashes being reported. Shortly after, President Trump deployed the National Guard, sending 2,000 members there to intervene. It's the first time in decades this has been done without a request from the governor. And now, Northern Command says 500 Marines are ready to deploy if the situation gets worse. Police have been using tear gas and rubber bullets to disperse the crowds. Earlier, demonstrators spilled onto the 101 freeway, causing it to partially shut down. Authorities say at least 56 people have been arrested so far. Let's bring in NBC News political and national correspondent.
Protests in LA escalate as National Guard deployment draws backlash. Over 100 immigrants detained in mass ICE operation. Protests in LA enter their fourth day following aggressive ICE raids. Over 100 detained, 2,000 National Guard troops deployed without governor's request. Tensions rise between federal actions and state leadership as demonstrators clash with law enforcement across the city.
Jacob Soboroff, live from Los Angeles, and NBC News senior Homeland Security correspondent Julia Ainsley. Now, Jacob, you've been on this developing story all weekend. We heard some of your interviews with Governor Gavin Newsom and the border czar, Tom Homan. What is the latest so far at this hour?
Well, Mika, I want to back up to Friday and talk about how unusual the situation is here in Los Angeles. On Friday morning, here in the LA bureau of NBC News, the first reports started coming in of ICE raids across Los Angeles. And local news had aerial footage of Bearcat, sort of tactical style vehicles who are out there protesting. And that scene repeated itself over the course of the next several days with, of course, the president, against the wishes of Governor Newsom, bringing in the National Guard, exercising Title 10 of the U.S. Code to bring in the National Guard to Los Angeles to protect it. It's very specific, federal property and federal agents that are carrying out these raids. The reason I say it's unusual is that this is not, and Julia can talk about this as well or better than I can, this is not the ordinary way that ICE has operated historically in Los Angeles or across the country. But under this, stated mass deportation program of the Trump administration, you are seeing raids at places like Home Depots, where day laborers are. Those were not targeted enforcement areas on a wide scale under Democratic nor Republican administrations previously, and has so many people on edge here in Los Angeles because we're a majority minority city. There are 50% plus people of color in Los Angeles, including many Latinos, including maybe as many as 1 million undocumented people here in the Los Angeles area. So it has devolved into this feud, which Governor Newsom says didn't need to happen. Mayor Bass said didn't need to happen. They do not want the National Guard here. And before the National Guard was here, quite frankly, these types of melees were not happening on the streets of Los Angeles. First, Tom Homan told me that he wasn't ruling out, as you saw at the beginning of the show, arresting Governor Newsom nor Mayor Karen Bass if they got in between the ICE enforcement operations and the federal agents. And then last night in the Emergency Operations Center, I spent some time with Governor Newsom as he monitored the situation here. And I asked him about what Tom Homan had said about arresting him. I want to play a little bit more of that sound for you right now, Mika. Watch this.
He's a tough guy. Why doesn't he do that? And he knows where to find me. But you know what? Let your hands off 4-year-old girls that are trying to get educated. Let your hands off these poor people. They're just trying to live their lives, man. Trying to live their lives, paying their taxes, been here 10 years. The fear, the horror, the hell is this guy? Come after me, arrest me, let's just get it over with. Tough guy. I don't give a damn. But I care about my community, I care about this community. The hell are they doing? These guys need to grow up, they need to stop, and we need to push back. And I'm sorry to be so clear, but that kind of bloviating is exhausting. So Tom, arrest me. Let's go.
So tough stuff from the governor of California, and caught in between this war of words, which is a feud that's familiar to so many people who have covered the relationship between Gavin Newsom and Donald Trump, are families, many mixed status families that live here in Los Angeles, meaning an undocumented maybe parent or relative and a young child, or even a teenager or somebody older than that who was born here in this country. The thing is, President Trump and Gavin Newsom have been talking behind the scenes, at least since the beginning of this began. I asked him about a phone conversation that they had on Friday night, and he said that they had a relatively cordial conversation, and this didn't come up. I want to give you a little bit more of what Governor Newsom said about his conversation on Friday night, Mika, with the president. Watch this.
Well, under his executive order, it specifically notes, and under what the DOD did, is they had to coordinate with the governor. of the state. They never coordinate with the governor of the state. We talked for almost 20 minutes, and this issue never came up. I mean, I kept trying to talk about L.A. He wanted to talk about all these other issues. We had a very decent conversation.
When was this?
This was late Friday night, I think about 1:30 plus his time.
After the protests that started here?
After the protests, and he never once brought up the National Guard. He's a stone-cold liar. He said he did. Stone-cold liar. Never did. It was a very civil conversation. I've always wanted to approach engagement with the President of the United States in a respectful and responsible way. But there's no working with the President. There's only working for him. And I will never work for Donald Trump. Where's your decency, Mr. President? Stop. Rescind this order. It's illegal and unconstitutional. And I said it, I'll say it again, it's immoral. You're creating the conditions that you claim you're solving, and you're not. And you're putting real people's lives at risk.
So that's what this is really all about, putting real people's lives at risk. And you've heard reports that there are riots on the streets of Los Angeles. There are certainly there has been civil unrest, reports of looting overnight. But on a wide scale, that is not what's happening across the city of Los Angeles. And I think it's important to emphasize that this is also not what was happening before the National Guard came to Los Angeles. That's the point that Governor Newsom is making. And that's why he has asked and said this morning he's filing a lawsuit, Mika, to get that authority back from the President of the United States and remove the deployment of the National Guard on the streets of Los Angeles, because he's saying that's what's inflammatory here. And caught in the crosshairs are these migrant residents of Los Angeles, many of whom have been here most of their entire lives.
Wow. Jacob, if you'd like to stand by and jump into the conversation as we continue to cover this, I'd like to move over to Julia now. And I really want to focus on what the California governor said there, and these are his words: President Trump creating the conditions you claim you are solving. You know, it's sort of what caused what at this point, and some might argue that the situation is triggering a lot of people, and the call for calm and for peace is extremely important at a time like this. What are you hearing about when the focus on Los Angeles was made, when that decision was made to deploy ICE and focus on LA in a big way?
You know, Mika, I see really two escalations.
What are you hearing about when the focus on Los Angeles was made, when that decision was made to deploy ICE and focus on LA in a big way?
You know, Mika, I see really two escalation points when we look at this timeline. And the first one, if you can believe it, goes back to January, before Trump was even in office, as the transition team started to map out where they wanted to focus across the United States. They were specifically pinpointing sanctuary cities. I know you have Tom Homan on later today. Sanctuary cities, I've often been told, is a thorn in Tom Homan's side. This is an area he wants clashes. He wants to see local law enforcement come up against ICE so that he can have showdowns like this and really push these policies. I remember at the time I was shocked because, of course, it's in cases like that as well, again, to have these clashes. And then something happened in mid-May when Stephen Miller called the leaders of ICE into Washington. He went over to ICE headquarters and said, look, if you don't start arresting 3,000 people per day, the bottom 10% of the field offices around the country, you will lose your leaders. I'll start firing them monthly if you don't get to 3,000 a day. Well, the only way to get to 3,000 a day, and we already saw them reach a high of 2,200 last week, still not 3,000 though, is to start doing workplace raids, start doing the kind of mass scale that they saw in LA last week. Mind you, that didn't necessarily turn into hundreds or thousands, but even dozens when you see it when people are going into apparel stores, for example, and doing arrests. And really, it's a lot easier to arrest non-criminal migrants, people who are going about their day-to-day, living in the addresses that they're telling us they live in, people who are wearing ankle monitors, reporting to their check-ins, going after criminals who know how to hide from the law. That takes a lot more people. I've been on those raids. The manpower, the investigations, the execution, keeping everyone safe, that takes as many as 8 people over, many manpower hours to arrest one person. So the lower hanging fruit here is what we're seeing them go after, and it's creating these clashes. Also overnight, Mika, we did see a response from the White House to Newsom. This is coming through our Gabe Gutierrez. They call Newsom They said he has feckless leadership and said his refusal to stop the violent attacks on law enforcement shows that feckless leadership. And they say it's a bald-faced lie for Newsom to claim there was no problem in Los Angeles before President Trump got involved. Everyone saw the chaos, violence, and lawlessness, unless, of course, Governor Newsom doesn't think any of that is a problem. That's coming from a White House spokeswoman, really escalating this clash between the White House and California leadership over what you're seeing happening in LA.
Governor Newsom calls Trump a liar, vows legal action, and slams National Guard deployment as unconstitutional overreach. NBC's Jacob Soboroff details Newsom's direct challenge to federal ICE operations. The California governor accuses Trump of deceiving him, denounces unconstitutional deployment of troops, and vows to sue the federal government to protect immigrant communities and regain state control.
So I've reported many times, we've discussed on this show frequently, that whenever the Trump administration wants to change the subject, they almost always reflexively go back to immigration, his signature issue. So whether it is because of the Elon Musk blow up or because of the controversy surrounding the piece of legislation working its way through the Senate, this changes the headlines. And to Julia's point, we know Stephen Miller and others in the administration have really wanted to increase those numbers. So David Drucker, we know the administration, they're not unhappy to have the images of whether it's a man in a mask and a Mexican flag and a car on fire behind him. We know that'll be dispersed on Fox News nonstop. That said, as Jacob has said and other reporters on the ground have said, those incidents are few and far between. The vast, vast majority of these protests peaceful. No excuse for violence, but the vast majority of people part of these protests are not violent. They're simply exercising their First Amendment rights. So let's start here with the Republicans. Is there a danger of overreach? Because many people believe it's this provocative move to put the National Guard on the streets that has escalated the tensions there. Could this backfire on Trump and the Republicans, or do you think this is exactly what they want?
Well, we know it's what they want. Could it backfire? Sure, and I think we should monitor that from a political standpoint over the next several weeks. But if you look at what happened in the 2024 election, if you look at where President Trump's approval ratings have been buoyed, even as dissatisfaction with his handling of the economy, especially because of the tariffs, it's been because he has maintained support for tough immigration enforcement. Look, for decades, this has been building politically in the United States, where people feel that illegal immigration was not being stopped, and the federal government really wasn't doing much of anything to fix it. And that really came to a head during the Biden administration. We saw that even with working class Hispanic voters. It's one of the reasons the Rio Grande Valley went almost entirely red. And we've done a lot of reporting on this at the Dispatch. This is not just people in the Midwest, the working class whites and all of that voted for Trump in 2016 and has stuck with him ever since. There was a shift right of Hispanics broadly, especially working class Hispanics, Hispanics making $50,000 a year and less. You can see the exit polling. They wanted tougher immigration enforcement. They thought it wasn't fair to allow illegal immigration to proliferate. They thought that the government wasn't treating people fairly from an economic standpoint. And so, sure, now that people are watching what it means to engage in a mass deportation policy, now that the government is putting boots on the ground, if you will, and I use that term carefully, to try and actually impact illegal immigration, opinions could change. But just assuming that this is 2008, 2012, and that never mind everybody else in the United States, that the Hispanic community is going to be reflexively opposed to what they see is a wrong assumption to make at the outset.
So new polling shows that the Trump administration's deportation program has a net positive approval rating. Overall, about 54% of Americans support the administration's approach, while 46% disapprove. Now, also in that poll, 63% believe that non-citizens should get a court hearing first before any deportation attempts. 37% of those surveyed say they should be deported first. So, Jim Vandehei, it's a bit of a complicated picture here. Americans, yes, to David's point, and that poll broadly support some of these Trump efforts, but they say, look, you have to follow the law. You have to have due process. You have to go through the courts. We don't know yet if they're going to approve of these really strong-arm tactics we're seeing in L.A. today. So, speak to us from the other side here, making it on a political lens, what the Democrats are doing. Certainly, Gavin Newsom standing up to Donald Trump. We just played that sound. Newsom and L.A. Mayor Karen Bass saying, we don't want the National Guard here, but we know immigration was a winner for Trump in 2024. What are the risks here for Democrats?
Yeah, I mean, first off, this was inevitable. Trump has wanted this since day one. He wants to go into California, wants to go into a sanctuary city, wants to show that he is commander in chief and that he can use the military at his disposal to silence critics. He believes, and I think the polling you just showed backs him up, that the vast majority of the country is supportive of his immigration policies broadly. Democrats know that. I mean, Democrats have been in a real bind trying to figure out how can they actually argue against Trump on immigration when the election results in the polling numbers show that people aren't with them on this specific topic. Now, what's different here is you're now moving from people who are in prison or people who are clearly criminals to people who've been in the United States, in some cases for a long time, in some cases paying taxes for a long time, working in jobs under the assumption that they could continue to operate that way as long as they didn't break the law and as long as they continued to pay taxes. So once you start to deport that group of people en masse, I think Democrats feel like, one, it's just not right. And so they are, I think when Gavin Newsom talks about it, I take him at his word. I do believe he believes what he's saying. I think they're willing to have this fight. I think they want it to go to the courts, and that they think ultimately that the American public will find it inhumane once you start to go after people who they feel like didn't do anything wrong. I think when it does go to the courts, for people thinking, oh, the courts are going to step in and say you can't use the military, I don't know that that's how this court is going to decide. I think it's very clear. The court feels like the president has a lot of authority, particularly when it's under the guise of national security. And I think he'll have a lot of freedom, even if this hasn't been done since 1965, and even if he takes it a step further and goes for the Insurrection Act. I think that he has the backing, and he feels like he has the backing of the courts to do this.
Analysts explore Trump's political motives behind immigration raids, media optics, and potential backlash from Hispanic communities. Panelists debate whether Trump is using immigration enforcement as a distraction from legislative controversy and Elon Musk fallout. While immigration plays well politically, excessive force may backfire. Polling shows divided public opinion as Democrats warn against mass deportations of longtime residents.
That has happened since as a distraction from his very public falling out with Elon Musk. Having said that, Donald Trump promised all along that this would be all about getting criminals off the streets, and it's certainly changed from that. At the same time, I wonder, does this move the needle in terms of public support toward Trump or away from him?
Well, first of all, it's given Elon Musk, it looks like, an opportunity to try and get back into Donald Trump's good books, because he's been tweeting over the last 12 hours about how there should be tougher law enforcement in California and these riots should have to stop. I think you have to look at the longer term. If Stephen Miller manages to have his way and is successful in deporting really millions of people who are in the country illegally, those people are people who work in businesses, in restaurants, in garages, they work in hotels, they work all around the country. They pay taxes. So the long-term impact of reducing America's labor force, reducing the revenue that those people bring in to the government's coffers, that could have some impact, I think, if this is a successful operation. But we don't quite know what that would be. In the short term, I think the Democrats have to handle this very carefully. I mean, Gavin Newsom is trying to play tough up against Donald Trump, but I think Jim's right. The courts, if this went to the courts, then they've shown that they're prepared to give the president an awful lot of power on this. And we know that Donald Trump, because General Milley told us, Donald Trump wanted to do this in the first term. This is exactly the playbook he wanted to enact around the Black Lives Matter protests. It doesn't really matter what the protests are. These are the images that the White House want their supporters to see around the country.
Jacob Soboroff, your thoughts listening to this conversation, and how much perhaps some leaders in the MAGA movement would love for protesters to become violent and out of hand.
Yeah, obviously, I think that these are images that play into President Trump's message, Mika. And this issue might have been a winning one in 2024, but I can tell you when it wasn't. And I and Julia together as reporters saw it firsthand was in 2018 at the height of the family separation policy. And I think that there's a fine line between doing this and mobilizing, particularly in Los Angeles, the type of response that we saw during 2018, where hundreds of thousands of people, maybe millions of people across not just the country, but the world, stood up. Even the Pope spoke out at the time against the deliberate separation of children from their parents at the hands of the Trump administration. And it's one thing, as Jim said, to go after, as Tom Homan had originally said at the beginning of this administration, sort of the worst of the worst, the violent offenders, the criminals, people who have committed very serious crimes. But now they're targeting day laborers at Home Depot. There are reports of seeing ICE outside of schools. There are literally millions of people here whose families are directly affected by immigration enforcement operations like this, many of whom have American citizens within that family. In 2018, they marched up and down the streets all around the world. Back in 2005, 2006, to protest for comprehensive immigration reform, there were 500,000 people on the streets of Los Angeles. And if and when that happens, I don't know that the public opinion, obviously we'll have to wait and see, will stay on the side of the Trump administration, because what's really behind all this, stories of families and people who are affected, undocumented people, are neighbors and coworkers and fellow parishioners and you name it, in a place like Los Angeles and in other cities across the country. Will this sort of tough talk, political feud between Newsom and Trump and Karen Bass, will that stay forefront, or will it become about the humanity as it was back in 2018?
Well, and those people you just mentioned are just simply terrified right now. NBC News political and national correspondent Jacob Soboroff, thank you for your coverage. We'll be seeing you again soon. Thank you very much. Also, we've got to get to the military aspect of this story, which is potentially historic. We have Courtney Kuby standing by, and we'll get to her in just a moment. Also still ahead on Morning Joe, President Trump warns.
Elon Musk supports Trump's crackdown, while Democrats warn mass deportations may hurt the economy and labor force. Elon Musk sides with Trump amid ICE crackdown, tweeting support for stricter enforcement. Analysts warn that deporting millions could harm the U.S. labor force and economy. Democrats walk a fine line, balancing court challenges with public concern over aggressive immigration tactics.
Our coverage continues now at 26 past the hour. President Trump is defending his response to the Los Angeles protests, calling the demonstrators, quote, insurrectionists. He made those comments on Truth Social last night, saying Governor Newsom and Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass should apologize for the, quote, horrible job they have done. But earlier, when speaking to reporters, Trump stopped short of saying the protests constituted an insurrection.
Are you prepared to invoke the Insurrection Act?
Depends on whether or not there's an insurrection. No, but you have violent people, and we're not going to let them get away with it. And when they spit at people, you know, they spit. That's their new thing. They spit, and worse, you know what they throw at them, right? And when that happens, I have a little statement. They say, they spit, we hit. And I told them, nobody's going to spit on our police officers. Nobody's going to spit on our military, which they do as a common thing. They get up to them this far away, and then they start spitting in their face. That happens, they get hit very hard.
Joining us now, NBC News senior national security correspondent Courtney Kuby. Courtney, let's talk about the military angle here with Marines on standby. What's the potential here for that to happen, and what would that mean?
So at this point, Mika, as far as we know, there's only about 300 of the National Guard, California National Guard troops who are actually on scene. There are at least 3 different locations. But remember, this authorization is to federalize up to 2,000. So it would make more sense if they would work through, or they would use all 2,000 of those before they would turn to those Marines. But what people need to remember is yes, these are California National Guard troops who are being used here. But we heard Jacob earlier talk about them being under Title X authority. What that means is they are essentially federalized. They are under the authority of the federal government. They're paid by them. They get benefits under the federal government while they're serving. And they are also under the same restrictions that federal troops face when they are operating in the United States. Why that's so critical in this case here is because if you have a National Guard soldier who is under California law, or who's under California state activation, that means that they are answering to and under the authority of the governor, Governor Newsom, who we've heard from earlier in the show already. Now, in that capacity, they have some ability to conduct law enforcement missions, to support the local law enforcement, but they have a little bit more authority with actually taking on or conducting law enforcement missions. Once those troops are federalized, that goes away. They can still support the LAPD and they can support the ICE agents who are there, but they cannot make arrests or conduct what we think of as very basic law enforcement activities. That's a violation of Posse Comitatus, which is an act that essentially says you can't have federal or federal troops conducting law enforcement in the continental United States. Now, what we usually see Title X troops, National Guard troops on federal duty doing is deploying overseas. And that would even be the case for this unit, the 79th Infantry Brigade Combat Team out of California. They have done these deployments overseas. So the Title X status is not uncommon. But putting them on Title X and then putting them in the United States, that's what's so uncommon here. And what's the most unique part about this is the president doing it despite the governor not asking for these troops, but specifically saying that he doesn't want the troops to be there. Now, the Marines here, 500 are now under or on a hot standby. They have to be ready to go very quickly. What's really critical about them is they will also be federalized. That makes sense. They are active duty. The question everyone should be asking here, though, Mika, is are they actually trained for any of the kinds of law enforcement or the sorts of functions that they could be called upon to do here? That's one of the questions we've been asking.
So, Courtney, there's been a lot of escalatory rhetoric from Trump's top advisor, Stephen Miller, posting simply one word, insurrection. J.D. Vance, similar. Trump himself suggesting that all of the federal law enforcement agencies should be involved. And, of course, Secretary of Defense Hegseth. So if the federal government decides to up the ante here with their response beyond what we've seen so far, what are some of the things they could do here? Because you're right, and all of it's being done against the wishes of local and state leaders.
So they can do very basic things in support of LAPD and ICE. So traffic enforcement, they can put them outside of federal buildings. That's one thing that we've already seen, where they're basically a show of presence. Now, we have seen from the video and the photos there that they are armed. We have asked about the basic rules of force here. When you're talking about an overseas mission or a combat, you hear rules of engagement. When you're talking in the homeland, they refer to it as rules of force. We don't have an answer beyond there. They are still under the authorities of the basic rules of force here. So presumably, that means that they will follow the law and they will, they'll protect federal buildings. They will protect ICE agents. They will protect any kind of federal personnel who are there, but they will not engage in things like arrests. Like I said, they could be at barricades hanging out there. One thing that I have been very struck by in this, Jonathan, and we got a statement from U.S. Northern Command late last night that said that they had established a task force. They're calling it Task Force 51. It's under a two-star general. Generally, when you have something, a brigade combat team is about 3,500 up to 5,000 different troops. This is smaller than that. It's about half that size, 2,000 troops. That would generally be under the authority of a colonel, okay? Instead, they are putting this task force under a two-star general. That shows, to me, the significance that they are placing on this, on this mission in general, that they are putting someone so high-ranking involved in it. Military officials, defense officials who I spoke with are very concerned about the possibility of the military being used here in ways that they should not be. And actually, the perception that they are actually fighting against or taking on civilians in the streets of L.A. And that may be one reason they have someone so senior overseeing this entire task force.
Yeah. And that certainly would change the nature of this situation and at this point of the presidency. NBC News senior national security correspondent Courtney Kuby, thank you very much.
Trump hints at invoking Insurrection Act as Marines prepare. Experts fear misuse of military under federal command. Trump labels LA demonstrators as insurrectionists and signals possible use of Insurrection Act. Marines are on standby. Experts raise legal and ethical concerns as National Guard troops, now federalized, cannot conduct arrests. Tensions between state and federal authority hit a boiling point.
For your coverage. We'll talk to you again soon. So Kilmar Abrego Garcia, the Maryland man who was forcibly removed from the country by mistake, sent at first to El Salvador, that super prison there, is now back in the U.S. Abrego Garcia appeared in a Tennessee federal court on Friday. He's now facing human smuggling charges after being named in an indictment. It alleges Abrego Garcia participated in a conspiracy over 9 years to move people from Texas deeper into the country, including members of the MS-13 gang. In a phone interview with NBC News on Saturday, President Trump said it wasn't his decision to bring Abrego Garcia back, but added, quote, "It should be a very easy case for the Department of Justice to win." Abrego Garcia is set to remain in the custody of U.S. Marshals until his next hearing on Friday. Let's go back to Julia on this. I assume the plan was to deport him correctly. What do you make of these charges against him? I understand they are fairly old, and when they first came up, it was a pretty weak case.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, the government had the chance to bring these charges earlier, didn't do that. And in 2019, a judge said that, in fact, Abrego Garcia had what's called a withholding of removal order. That's even a higher standard than getting asylum, and that he specifically couldn't be sent back to El Salvador. So now Abrego Garcia's lawyers are saying they want that same judge to decide if that withholding of removal order should be taken away in light of these new charges. Now, of course, he'll have to go through the federal process. And if he is convicted, and as you mentioned, they had a chance to do this previously, but if he is found guilty of these charges and he's convicted, he would serve his time here in the United States before being deported. I think that's a lot of times something that goes missing in this conversation is that when we talk about criminal immigrants in the United States that aren't in ICE detention, oftentimes they're actually serving time in the Bureau of Prisons. And then after that, they can be deported if the penal system, if the whatever group, whether it's federal or state, actually talks to ICE and is able to get them deported. So in this case, he will have that chance. That's all his lawyers have really asked for. And in each case that the White House or DHS comes up with more information about this man's background, whether it be in restrictive, protective orders that his wife requested, whether it has to do with this stop in Tennessee where they found 6 other people with him. He was interviewed for a long time, but in the end, never really convicted of smuggling. In any of these cases, they've just said, give him a chance to defend himself in court, because the exact process that Trump used to deport him and so many others under the Alien Enemies Act meant they never had that chance. And so as the White House started to bring up more things to defend the characters, they never had that chance. So he's brought back, and his lawyers say they look forward to being able to defend these charges in a U.S. court.
We'll see what happens. NBC News senior Homeland Security correspondent Julia Ainsley, thank you very much for your reporting this morning. So President Trump says he assumes his relationship with Elon Musk is now over after their feud exploded online last week. When asked by NBC's Kristen Welker if he has any desire to repair ties with Musk, Trump said no, adding that he has no intention of speaking to the Tesla CEO. Trump also issued a warning to Musk, saying he will face very serious consequences if he funds Democratic candidates to run against Republicans who vote in favor of the budget bill. He did not share what those consequences would be. The president also cast doubt on the notion that Musk's opposition will sink the bill, claiming he is more confident than ever it will pass because Republicans are more unified in the wake of the public feud. David Drucker, he was not popular in the administration. The president might be right about that. At the same time, what does this falling out show about the president's relationships with people? And is it possible they could repair it?
Well, you know, we've seen over the years that Trump will bring someone into the fold, then he'll kick him out of the fold, then he'll bring him into the fold. And this, I mean, it's almost like as the world turns, right? And this has been very entertaining to watch. I've got a 10-year-old and a 9-year-old, a 13-year-old and a 9-year-old, and I don't know if they get into it as much as these two have over the past couple of days. But I do think what is interesting here, aside from the entertainment value, is that Elon Musk, Elon Musk, unlike most people that Trump brings in and out of his circle, actually has a media platform and lots of money. And so if Elon Musk wants to go to war with Trump, I don't know that he wins in the sense that he has a lot of federal contracts, Starlink, and the like, that make his companies a lot of money. People have talked about the EV tax credit. That's peanuts compared to the EPA waiver, which Trump's EPA is likely to cancel, which will cost Elon's Tesla billions annually, and that probably would happen anyway. But if he really was serious about putting money behind other candidates to challenge Republicans in primaries, to start some sort of a new party, I mean, third parties have a very thin history of working in the United States. But the point is, he's got the money to do it, and that would be worth paying attention to.
Caddy.
Yeah, Jim, following up on David's point just there, it was clear that the president has said, listen, to Elon Musk, you can't fund Democratic candidates. They'll be all hell to pay if you do. And then it was interesting that over the weekend, Cory Booker was asked, would you take money from Elon Musk? And he said, absolutely no way. I wouldn't take money from Elon Musk. But I've had several Democrats and centrist Republicans say to me, Democrats shouldn't miss an opportunity here. You know, if Elon Musk, with all his money and all his X machine, is really prepared to walk away from MAGA world or to walk away from Donald Trump, why wouldn't they embrace him with open arms and try and bring him into their fold? Are they missing something here?
I think they're missing the fact that I don't think that's really on the table. I've not seen anything from Elon that suggests he suddenly wants to become a Democrat or become a liberal. What he said is he's really frustrated with Trump. He's obviously pretty bummed that he could lose some of the incentives that he needs for Tesla. But I think at the end of the day, his politics are libertarian or whatever, however he would describe them, are much closer to Trump's. I think that over time, there's a lot of people behind the scenes who are trying to repair this relationship. Both of them kind of need each other. Remember, like Elon Musk, yes, he has gobs of money. He's the richest individual on the planet. But if you think about his businesses, whether it's Neuralink, whether it's, building AI, space, satellites, autonomous technology, all of that is highly regulated, and all of that is highly intertwined with the federal government. The federal government really can't run its space program right now without Elon Musk. Elon Musk can't really have a space company without the federal government. And so I think over time, they'll probably figure out a way to heal. I think one of the reasons this is sort of entertaining, it's the first time Trump has basically gone against someone who's just like him. Like, the similarities between the two are striking. They both think they can say or do whatever they want, that they live by a different set of rules, and that their past success has validated their behavior. And so that is really animating a little bit of this in the short term. But I think you already see Elon in his own way trying to ease the tension. And I think over time, Trump will see that he does need the power of X, which is I would argue is still the most powerful platform in media today, certainly for MAGA media. And when they think about elections, when they think about power, combining governmental power with media power gives you almost absolute power. And so I think over time, they'll figure out a way to heal.
So I reported and wrote for The Atlantic over the weekend, broke the news that Elon Musk, as his time as a special government employee, that 130-day contract was expiring. He asked the White House to stay on. He wanted to extend his time in government. President Trump said no. At that point, Trump had sort of tired of Elon Musk. Certainly cabinet members, senior staff were tired of Musk. They had clashed, but they still wanted to give him a graceful send-off. They didn't want him to become a political enemy. Well, we saw what happened. Musk picked this fight. He escalated this fight last week, but he does have more to lose, Mika. I think that's important here, that Musk has so many government contracts. His fortune's already taken a major hit since he went into government service because of the declining sales of Tesla and the like. He's trying to still get a good return on his investment from his backing Trump with campaign funds. but he stands to lose a fortune if these contracts are canceled, and Trump has threatened that. That said, the White House doesn't want Musk to be an enemy either. They know he is a very powerful and mercurial figure. We saw over the weekend sort of a new reality, whereas Caddy had mentioned earlier, Musk praised some of the things Trump was doing, particularly on these issues in Los Angeles, but also was still critical of the spending bill, still floating the idea of a new political party. Right. So there's sort of an uneasy detente at the moment, but we know these two men, it could flare up at any time.
Right, and also if he cared about losing money, wouldn't he have left a lot sooner? So it'll be interesting to see how this moves forward. Senior writer for The Dispatch, David Drucker, thank you very much for coming.
Wrongly deported man now faces smuggling charges. Case questions fairness of expedited removal tactics under Trump. Kelmar Abrigo Garcia, wrongfully deported to El Salvador, is now back in U.S. custody. Though accused of smuggling, his lawyers cite past legal protection. The case spotlights concerns over hasty deportations under the Alien Enemies Act and demands due legal process.
Welcome back to Morning Joe. It is Monday, June 9th. California Governor Gavin Newsom says he plans to sue the Trump administration over its decision to deploy the National Guard in Los Angeles. Large groups have been protesting recent immigration raids in the city, and some demonstrators have clashed with law enforcement. NBC News correspondent Steve Patterson has the very latest.
Protesters and law enforcement officials squaring off after days of raids, riots, and demonstrations. And a rare move by President Trump, mobilizing 2,000 California National Guard troops against the will of the state's governor. Another major flashpoint in front of the federal detention center where undocumented immigrants captured by ICE are being held. In nearby Compton, chaos. Protests there dissolving into lawlessness, demonstrators upending roadblocks, setting off fireworks, while a small group of looters broke into a gas station. These protests followed a day of skirmishes between authorities and protesters outside of a Home Depot. Law enforcement firing tear gas and non-lethal rounds into several crowds.
I couldn't see who was shooting, but they were trying to aim right at me, which is like it's very scary.
Sheriff Robert Luna saying his deputies only acted as peacekeepers and didn't assist with any federal action.
We will protect your right to peacefully protest, but we cannot and will not tolerate violence or destruction of property.
Governor Gavin Newsom accused President Trump of attempting to manufacture a crisis by mobilizing the National Guard, adding he's hoping for chaos so he can justify more crackdowns, more fear, more control. Trump's border czar, Tom Homan, defended the move to NBC's Jacob Soboroff and says about 150 undocumented immigrants have been detained in the last few days.
But not just to protect the law enforcement, to protect the general public. If Democratic leaders want to turn their back on public safety, they can.
Tensions reaching a boiling point as more troops hit the ground.
Later in the show, Tom Homan will be joining us live here on Morning Joe. That was NBC's Steve Patterson with that report. Jonathan Lemire, Pablo Torre, and Jim Vandehei are still with us and joining the conversation. We have NBC News national affairs analyst and a partner and chief political columnist at Puck, John Hellman, and politics bureau chief and senior political columnist for Politico, Jonathan Martin is here with us, along with NBC News investigative reporter Andrew Blankstein, who's live in Los Angeles. And Andrew, I'll start with you. I want to get a sense of the state of the police in Los Angeles in terms of staffing and resources. And also, you're looking specifically at how Trump administration officials are posting about all of this. Tell us what you found.
Well, Mika, as you said, I mean, when we talk about the Los Angeles Police Department and resources, there's truly a thin blue line. One of the things during the 1990s, the goal was to reach 10,000 officers, which under Chief Charlie Beck, they reached in 2014. Since then, and post George Floyd protests here in Los Angeles, it's gone down to about 8,700 officers. And if you take into account this is a city of 4 million people spread out over 500 square miles, and just the things that police have to do every day to respond to 1 million plus calls every year for calls for service, you start to think about the scope of what police have to deal with every day. Then you take into account events like what we've seen escalate the last 3 days. And we've gone from hundreds of people, from dozens to hundreds to thousands of people showing up. And as some of the pictures have shown, getting into pitched battles with the police on the streets. One of my sources said last night it was a long day and an even longer night. And some of that video obviously is going to be emerging. But this shows no signs of letting up. We have more protests scheduled for today. We have a sense that, you know, where does this end and how many more people are going to be drawn in, given the fear and the anger from these ICE operations. And again, caught in the middle are the LAPD and the Sheriff's Department. And while they welcome some of the rhetoric in terms of support for people that engage in activity that targets law enforcement, they are also concerned about some of the rhetoric between public officials that has taken place on social media.
Well, specifically Pam Bondi, the FBI director, the Pete Hegseth, DOD, the vice president and the president, a lot of them focusing specifically either on Los Angeles or on the governor.
Yes, Mika. And the thing is, when you look at compared to other big incidents here in Los Angeles, and I was here for the Rodney King riots, I was here for the George Floyd protests. And when you consider that this wasn't really an element before, where you would have agencies and individuals commenting, and also in interviews commenting directly critical of public officials. The question mark becomes, when you need kind of a united front, why is this happening? And I think people are asking that tonight.
Yeah, NBC News investigative reporter Andrew Blankstein, thank you very much.
Law enforcement under strain in LA. Leaders caution divisive rhetoric worsens ICE-related protests and chaos. Governor Newsom accuses Trump of engineering chaos by deploying National Guard. Police resources are strained as protests escalate. Officials caution that incendiary rhetoric online may further destabilize the situation, complicating law enforcement efforts amid mass unrest and immigration-related raids.
When they spit at people, you know, they spit. That's their new thing. They spit, and worse, you know what they throw at them, right? And when that happens, I have a little statement. They say, they spit, we hit. And I told them, nobody's going to spit on our police officers. Nobody's going to spit on our military, which they do as a common thing. They get up to them this far away, and then they start spitting in their face. That happens, they get hit very hard.
All right, that brings us to our next conversation. Joining us now, Democratic Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut. Thank you very much for coming on this morning, focusing on Los Angeles and the Marines that are standing by. What's your take on where this is headed?
Well, I think it's first important to point out that Donald Trump is just not telling the truth. There's been property damage, but these are pretty isolated protests. There's just no doubt that the local law enforcement can handle them. And, we've all listened to Donald Trump's affection for martial law. We've watched him try to destroy our democracy and the rule of law over the last 6 months. And so, of course, it's incredibly concerning to see him threatening a federal takeover here. This is the first time in 60 years that you've had a president deploy the National Guard without a request of the local governor. But it can also be true that everything that's happened in the last 7 days between the fight with Elon Musk and now the deployment of the National Guard is probably also a distraction from the main story, which is that right now Donald Trump is trying to pass probably the most unpopular piece of legislation that he will attempt to move through Congress in his first term. He's going to throw 15 million people off their health care in order to fund a massive tax cut for the wealthy. It's going to add $2 trillion to our deficit. We're probably going to head into a recession. And so I do also think he's probably doing everything he can to try to get the entire political world to be talking about anything other than a piece of legislation that's going to fundamentally change this country. So, yeah, we have to point out the danger of what he's proposing to do in Los Angeles while also keeping our eye on the ball, which is a bill that's going to transform our economy and ruin a lot of lives.
Many things can be true at the same time. Having said that, people are very upset about these ICE raids in Los Angeles for these poor, terrified families. The initial promise was that these deportations would be for criminals only. That's clearly not what's happening here as they're trying to make certain numbers. What's your message to protesters? And also, what can elected officials do at this point? And your take on how Gavin Newsom is doing?
Well, I mean, my first message is to keep it peaceful. I mean, obviously, this is a moment where we have to be on the streets all over the country to protest what's happening to our immigrant community, but more broadly to protest what's happening to our democracy. This is the most corrupt administration in the history of the country, and we are going to rise to this moment by being out there on the streets. But ultimately, I think the country sees what Donald Trump is trying to do here. He's looking for a fight. There's nothing in what he is doing that is about peace or about restoring order. He's taking a protest that is relatively isolated. People in Los Angeles over the weekend would tell you that 99% of them went about their day, and it was pretty normal because this is not an invasion that has taken over the entire city. And he's trying to turn a protest that is pretty small into something that involves an even bigger confrontation so that he might actually be able to invoke the Insurrection Act. That would be a defining story of the week if he were to do it. And I just don't think, I think we have to make sure that we understand to not take him at his word. He's looking for a fight. He's not trying to calm tensions.
Senator, we'll turn to the bill in just a moment. One last beat on this. Is there any peril you see for Democrats, though, to be dismissive of what is happening there? If there is an image of a burning car, let's say, if there is some violence, even if it's isolated, what are the political risks here? How do you talk about that?
Well, listen, I think you make it clear that we only are for peaceful protest, but I don't think the American public wants martial law. I think the American public knows that local law enforcement can handle these protests. And, what we also have to talk about is that, Donald Trump only cares about protests when they're opposing him. I mean, every single day we should be reminding the American public that there were protesters at the Capitol fighting for Donald Trump to install him in power permanently on January 6th of 2021, who beat the hell out of police officers with metal poles and tasers and are out on the street today. So Donald Trump only cares about quelling violent protest or quelling protest writ large when it's protest against him. That's fundamentally undemocratic. And it's frankly an invitation for more violence on the streets. The message is simply, if you're violent in service of a Republican cause, you'll get a get out of jail free card. But if you're engaged in protest against the administration, well, then we're sending in the National Guard.
So, Senator, you were just on Twitter a few moments ago suggesting that, look, you got to be able to do two things at once. Talk about this, but keep your eye on the ball. And in your estimation, that is indeed the legislation that's now in the Senate. Give us a sense as to what you see of it, and also what you're hearing from your Republican colleagues there, who a week or so back, as it was finishing up in the House, made clear they had some reservations.
Well, of course they have reservations. This is a bill that will ruin people's lives all across the country. You're talking, as I mentioned, about a bill that would throw 15 million people off of their health care. And for what? In order to fund a new massive tax cut for the wealthy and corporations, the richest Americans would get reportedly a $270,000 tax cut from this bill. And the bill would actually make 40% of the American public poorer, because the tax cuts for the poor and the middle class are like table scraps, but they'd lose their nutrition benefits for their kids. They'd lose their health care. They'd lose a whole bunch of services. Yes, I think Republicans are taking a look at this and wondering whether they can survive re-election. And so there is a chance that we can get the 4 votes in the Senate we need to stop this abomination of a bill. But it does require us talking about it. There was a CBS poll in the last week that suggested only about 30% of Americans Republicans know that there's a piece of legislation in front of the Congress that would do this much damage to the economy. So that makes sense. Donald Trump's going to distract you with a fight with Elon Musk. He's going to distract you with National Guard troops because he knows that if only 30 or 40% of the American public know that he's about to throw 15 million people off of their health care, working families, then maybe Republicans won't be under the kind of pressure that they should be under to stop it.
Democratic Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut. Thank you, Senator, for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Jonathan Martin, we want to, you Senator, obviously an opponent of this bill. He name-checked another person who's opponent of this bill. That's Elon Musk. So that the fight with Donald Trump has faded from the headlines just a touch because of everything else that's going on.
Right.
But it's still simmering.
Yeah.
What's the latest your reporting tells you about what Musk is considering doing next, and how did the Trump folks going to respond?
I think the handicapping on the Elon Donald rapprochement is moving from Labor Day to July 4th. I think that the guys in Vegas, as Brett Musburger used to say, our friends in the desert,
yeah.
are moving this thing up a little bit. Elon wants back in. Okay, you just look at his Twitter feed. You don't have to be a forensic psychologist to know that he wants back in. He's trying to be a team player. He's pushing out American flag emojis over the weekend. He knows that Trump's got more power and leverage than he has, and I think he realizes that he's got to be inside the tent, not outside the tent. Here's the good news for Elon Musk. Donald Trump, to borrow the old phrase, doesn't have any permanent friends or any permanent enemies. Donald Trump is welcoming folks back. I mean, you look at all the people over the years, John, who he exiled and then brought back in. So, look, I think Trump's open for business. I think it's going to be a little challenging for Elon with some of the Trump sort of Praetorian Guard, especially given the Epstein bomb he dropped. But Donald Trump himself, if you're willing to bend the knee, he'll have you back. And so I think it's happening. I think it's a matter of when.
And I think you don't even have to bend the knee nearly as deeply when you have control over X and you have all that money. I mean, Trump has let people back in for way less than what Elon Musk has to offer. But what do you do? What's the Musk took down a bunch of those tweets, right? But in terms of the dynamics on Capitol Hill, what is the Musk is still pretty firmly out there, voicing some fears that Republican deficit hawks, example, on the Senate side, we're already nurturing and thinking about opposing this bill. How does that play out in terms of the legislation?
I think Musk's leverage on the Hill is mostly his money. I think that the members of Congress aren't taking his insights about the various elements of the bill to heart. I mean, I think for them, there's two things. It's cool to get a picture with Elon Musk you posted online if you're a member of Congress, because he's Elon Musk. Although they're probably less cool now that he did the Epstein thing.
Right.
I was joking last week about the poor staffers on Capitol Hill having to scrub their bosses' social media accounts with the Elon pictures now. But I think the main leverage he has on the Hill is not his criticism of the bill. It's more just, am I going to fund the midterms next year for you guys or not, right? Or play in primaries, which is the actual fear of, would he be willing to go the next step and say, I'm going to take out folks if they vote for this bill? I just don't think he's going to do that, John.
Jonathan, I want to put aside the exercise that I have been haunted by all weekend, which is what would Republicans do if there was an equivalent story to this that happened among the Democrats? I want to put that thought experiment to the side for a second, because what the Republicans are actually doing, according to your new column for Politico magazine, is something that's on a different topic, right?
Yes.
So the title is, gee, I don't know how we can stop this. Republicans are prepared to push Trump on Putin.
Yes.
So what is happening inside the GOP right now in real life?
This is now on Russia and Ukraine. Trump is not where 90% of his party in the Senate is on Russia. Trump sort of takes a hashtag both sides view, to borrow the old Twitter phrase, toward Russia and Ukraine. He just wants the war to end, and he's annoyed at both sides for fighting. That's not where his party is in the Senate. His party is still made up of traditional Russia hawks who want to take really tough, punitive steps towards Putin to get both sides to the table to get a better deal for Ukraine. Trump just wants it to end, period. So Lindsey Graham has this bill in the Senate that would levy really tough secondary sanctions on countries who are buying oil and gas from the Russians to squeeze the Russian economy. And the challenge is that John Thune's uneasy about bringing that bill to the floor unless and until he has at least some kind of a Trump wink and nod. And Trump isn't giving Thune that because Trump doesn't want to sign the bill. And it's not even clear, guys, that Trump even wants the leverage of the Senate simply passing the the bill. So if you're the Senate Republicans, you have overwhelming support. This bill's got 82 co-sponsors. It's hard to get that for like mom and apple pie in the U.S. Senate. But they don't want to bring it to the floor if Trump is just going to then denounce it or say he doesn't want it, right? Because then they're back to square one.
Yeah, and Trump has made clear to this point he has not supporting this, and he wants to support it, and he wants to pull back. But as he pulls back, Russia's stepping into the breach. And we should note, Ukraine overnight, Mika, says that Russia launched 479 drones, which would be the war's biggest single-day drone bombardment yet. So in the last few weeks, as the U.S. has been said, Trump has been signaling that he's going to step away from the ceasefire talks. Putin has only escalated his bombardment of Ukraine.
All right, Politico's Jonathan Martin, thank you. John Hallman, thank you as well. And coming up, our next guest is making the argument for bringing back communal kid. Welcome back to Morning Joe, a live look at Reagan National Airport in Washington, D.C. A new piece in The Atlantic argues it really does take a village to raise a child, and the village should be able to dole out some tough love at times. Joining us now, contributing writer for The Atlantic, Stephanie Murray. She's the author of the new article entitled Bring Back Communal Kid Discipline. And so, Stephanie, thanks for coming on to talk about this. I will say that they have it in Poland, and it is fantastic. But for our viewers, explain what communal kid discipline is.
I guess I would describe it as the willingness of people, adults in general, to correct or instruct or kind of guide people's children who aren't theirs, like children that are not their own children. And I have experienced it far more outside the U.S. than I have inside the U.S., I would say.
Yeah, and so in the U.S., I think if somebody tried to help out with someone else's kid, you might risk getting sued or something. I mean, there's definitely, things have changed. When you say bring it back, did we used to have it where you're in a grocery store, this would happen in Poland, and a kid is melting down, maybe 2 or 3 moms will get involved and be like, absolutely not, daję spokój, and sort of discipline the child along with the child's mother or parent who is there.
Yeah, so speaking to historians about this, I'm too young, I think, to remember this, but there was a time in America where we took a much more collective approach to basically every aspect of parenting kids, but to discipline included in that, right? So, up until sounds like things really started to change in the middle of the 20th century, but up until that point, it was very normal and expected for a whole range of other adults, including sometimes strangers, to just sort of step in and say, hey, knock it off, or hey, you're going the wrong way, or are you really supposed to be here? Why don't I walk you home, or whatever it is, breaking up a fight. That was normal at one point.
So what's the big takeaway of your piece? Should we start thinking about helping out parents in the middle of a meltdown?
Well, so, I don't know about, I would take it as progress even if we could get some small steps in the direction of like, hey, if a kid is like rummaging through your purse or something like that. Like, I think even things have gotten to the point where in America, people are very wary of talking to another person's child if they, in any sort of like guidance way, right? So I think it would be progress. Maybe you don't get involved when there's a tantrum, but if you could just sort of see, oh, a kid is climbing, on me or on this big gate that seemed kind of dangerous or something like that. Yeah, I think it would be very appropriate to just sort of say, hey, I don't think you should be up there, or could you please get out of my stuff, right? Just talk directly to the kid. I think that feels very doable, feels very appropriate, and speaking to a range of adults about this, Americans, I actually think people are more open to it, including parents, than people might think.
Because it's so helpful. The new piece for sure. The new piece for The Atlantic is online now. Contributing writer Stephanie Murray, thank you so much for coming on the show this morning. And still ahead on Morning Joe, this month marks 42 years since
Senator Murphy accuses Trump of using LA unrest to distract from a harmful healthcare bill slashing coverage. Senator Chris Murphy warns Trump is inflaming LA unrest to distract from an unpopular healthcare bill. He calls for peaceful protests and criticizes misuse of federal troops. Murphy urges Democrats to highlight the legislation's potential harm while resisting martial law narratives. The June 9th episode of Morning Joe on MSNBC delivered a sweeping and urgent narrative about escalating tensions between the Trump administration and the state of California over immigration enforcement. At the heart of the show was the fallout from ICE raids in Los Angeles, followed by President Trump's controversial deployment of 2,000 National Guard troops without the consent of California Governor Gavin Newsom. This unprecedented move drew sharp rebukes and set off a chain reaction of protests, lawsuits, and political commentary. The broadcast began with a fiery soundbite, Governor Gavin Newsom directly challenging Tom Homan, the former ICE director and Trump ally, saying, "Arrest me if you dare." This moment captured the spirit of defiance brewing among California's leaders. Newsom's emotional response was not just rhetorical. It came amid ICE operations that saw over 100 immigrants detained, many of whom had no criminal record and had lived in the U.S. for years. In protest, demonstrators flooded the streets, leading to at least 56 arrests and National Guard troops stationed throughout LA. A key focus of Morning Joe was the legality and motivation behind Trump's unilateral federal deployment. Analysts pointed out that invoking Title X authority to federalize troops without the governor's approval is virtually unprecedented and may violate posse comitatus, a long-standing law restricting federal military involvement in domestic law enforcement. Correspondents Jacob Soboroff and Julia Ainsley revealed that the Trump administration, particularly advisor Stephen Miller, had planned these mass raids months in advance, targeting sanctuary cities like Los Angeles. Their reporting emphasized that ICE was now conducting sweeps at places like Home Depot and schools, locations that had never been targeted under previous Democratic or Republican administrations. The raids, they argued, were designed for maximum visibility and political impact. The panel also questioned whether Trump's moves were intended to distract from other crises, notably his falling out with Elon Musk and the unpopularity of his new healthcare bill. Senator Chris Murphy described Trump's actions as a manufactured crisis aimed at shifting public attention away from legislation that could throw millions off healthcare to finance tax breaks for the wealthy. The episode further examined the strategic risks for both parties. While tough immigration policies have long been a cornerstone of Trump's base, several commentators cautioned that the optics of deporting longtime residents and separating families could backfire, especially among Latino voters and moderate Americans. They noted polling that showed public support for immigration enforcement, but with a strong preference for due process and humane treatment. Perhaps the most sobering part of the episode came when military analyst Courtney Cube explained the implications of federalizing the California National Guard. While nominally a support force, these troops are barred from conducting arrests and direct law enforcement. The presence of Marines on standby and a 2-star general assigned to the mission raised alarms about potential misuse of military force against civilians, something rarely seen in modern U.S. history. The final segments shifted to the Elon Musk-Trump feud, which, while seemingly peripheral, underscored the broader theme: Trump's volatile alliances and willingness to escalate conflicts, whether with tech billionaires, state governors, or protesters, when it suits his narrative. As Morning Joe's analysts noted, Trump may eventually reconcile with Musk, but the deeper concern remains his pattern of governance through confrontation and chaos. In conclusion, Morning Joe painted a picture of a nation grappling not only with immigration and protests, but with deeper questions about democracy, federalism, and the rule of law. The show framed Trump's actions in Los Angeles not just as law enforcement, but as a political gambit with profound implications for American civil liberties, military boundaries, and public trust.